again back to DePaul University. My name is Charles Strain. I'm a professor of religious studies here at DePaul University. Our speaker tonight is Philip Jenkins, who is the Distinguished Professor of History in the Institute for Studies of Religion at Baylor University, formerly in the Department of Religious Studies at Penn State University. He's the author of numerous books, most especially The Next Christendom, The Coming of Global Christianity, which is now in its third edition, really a groundbreaking, significant work. More recently, he has written The Lost History of Christianity, that offers a revolutionary view of the history of the Christian Church. The subtitle is incredibly intriguing: The 1,000-Year Golden Age of the Church in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, and How It Died. Then in 2011, he has written Laying Down the Sword: Why We Can't Ignore the Bible's Violent Verses. Tonight, Professor Jenkins will speak on the Catholic Church in the year 2050. So please welcome Professor Jenkins.
Sorry about that. I have one main assignment this evening, which is not to let my terror show. Because increasingly as I looked at this event and I looked at who was speaking here, and I thought, uh-oh, these are people who know a lot. This is a problem. What can I say that's different? So I thought long and hard and de profundis clamavi, and I tried to focus on a couple of areas that perhaps I do have something new to say, and I hope you will bear with me. The theme of diaspora and migration in Christian history. The first thing I would like to say is that there is a great history here, and perhaps far more than many of us are aware of. We tend to think of a certain narrative of how Christianity spreads, and it's much neater than the reality. And I'm very interested in something that I sometimes call the Daniel syndrome, which is what happens when somebody is brought to a particular society as a slave, or a captive, or a member of an unwilling diaspora, and ends up having a vast influence on that society. I give you two historical examples. One is one of the greatest women in Christian history, who is not too well known in the West, who is a woman called Saint Nino of Georgia in the Caucasus. And if you ever read the histories of her life, then they try very hard to emphasize her aristocratic and royal background, and she was the sister of Saint George, and so on and so on. And then there's one account which gives the truth, which is she was a slave, which is she arrived as a poor slave in the society. Through her life, and through her counsels, and through her healing, she did much to convert the royal family, and made Georgia one of the first 2 or 3 first Christian kingdoms in the world, before the Roman Empire. And she is commonly remembered in Georgia today as Saint Nino, equal of the apostles. The other great diaspora figure is rather more known, though perhaps not entirely in this regard, who is that man who again was carried off as a slave, returned to his homeland, but came back to minister to fellow captives, poor migrants, and spent his life counseling and protecting and ministering to the poor women who had been wrenched from their home societies, even if that meant writing abusive and violent letters to the kings who abused and molested them. And we know him as St. Patrick. And when you think of St. Patrick in terms of green and chasing snakes, you don't know half the story. He was a much greater man than that. If you ever want a patron saint of diaspora Christians, you can toss a coin, but Nino and Patrick would both do very well. Thank you. But the other area I think I have something to say on the subject of diaspora is in the area of numbers. When we talk about diaspora, we talk about movement, but let's think of this as a supply and demand situation. Where are all these diaspora figures, where are all these diaspora people coming from? And I would suggest that the more we pay attention to the demography, to the numbers underlying this story, not just does the diaspora picture become clearer, but the state of Christianity worldwide, perhaps of all religion worldwide, also becomes very clear. You know, I think about an American historian, great historian called Oscar Handlin, and he began to write the history of immigration in American history. And ultimately, he said, he gave up and he realized that American history was the history of immigration. I want to suggest to you that the more you look at world Christianity, global Christianity, the more it is a history of migration, of diaspora. And as I've suggested, that is not a new thing. Look at Nino, and look at Patrick, and look at many others like them. But we live in an age when that is more especially true than in any other. We live in an age when Christianity is changing very rapidly. In numerical terms, as I sometimes say, Christianity is a religion that was born in Africa and Asia, and in our lifetimes has decided to go home. And there are particular reasons for that shift, and they're to do with demography. And some of these may seem to be common sense views, and bear with me if I perhaps make them a little explicit. I always like to recollect a passage of, well, it's St. Paul University, so why not speak of Vincent himself, and his words in 1640. Possibly the worst year in European history before 1940. Catholics were killing Protestants, Protestants were killing Catholics, Christians were killing Jews, and many feared whether Christian civilization would survive. And Vincent, of course, made his comment that Jesus said his church would last till the end of time. He never mentioned the word Europe. The church of the future, he said, would be the church of South America, of Africa, of China and Japan. Or to put it another way, we live in a time when Christianity is being uprooted from its world that is Western, educated, industrial, rich and democratic, W-E-I-R-D. It is leaving its weird phase and moving to a more global phase. And what you see time and again there is the story of numbers. And what I will do, if you don't mind, is I'll begin by speaking of Christianity generally, and then focusing in on the Catholic aspect of the picture. And if you are saying, how can anyone speak of the Catholic Church in 2050? So many things can happen between now and then. Well, absolutely they can. But so many of the important numbers, I believe, are set and are very unlikely to change substantially, so I think I can make these comments. The most important change, obviously, is the shift of the focus of Christianity outside Europe and to Africa, Asia, Latin America. And you see this, for example, in the continent of Africa, which back in 1900 had 10 million Christians, representing about 10% of the population. By 2000, that was 360 million, representing about 46% of the population. By some estimates, that number crested 500 million round about now. And depending on which estimate you read, that should be of the order of 1 billion by 2050. By 2050, barring major cometary strikes or epidemics, Africa will be the largest Christian continent. And if you look at that in terms of the Catholic Church, again, it's a revolution. Back in 1900, there were a couple of million Catholics on the African continent. By 2000, there were 120 million. By 2025, there should be about 230 million. Put another way. In 2000, Africans made up 1/8 of the Catholic Church. By 2025, that number will be 1/6. By 2050, that will be 1/4. And that proportion will grow steadily henceforward. So we might ask, what is happening here? Is it a story of conversions? Well, yes, indeed it is. But it's also part of a demographic change which, if you do not grasp, not just do you not see the shape of Christianity worldwide, but you do not see where the migrants and the diasporas are coming from and where they have their roots. There is one number that I would like you to bear in mind. Sorry, I just need one thing. Good. There's one number which I would like you to bear in mind, and this is the only mathematical element of what I have to say today, and that is the number 2.1. If you remember the number 2.1, everything will be clear. It's the most important number in the world because it is, it is the fertility rate, the average number of children that a woman will have in her lifetime, which secures stability. No increase, no decline. If it is significantly over 2.1, then a society is going to have a rising population and it's going to have a very young population. If it's 5 or 6, then you will have a young, very rapidly growing population. If it's significantly below 2.1, it will be a shrinking, aging population. Now, always distrust anyone who utters the sentence, the most important thing in the world today, because they're probably trying to sell you something. But nonetheless, it is. Is the demographic revolution that began in Europe in the 1960s and 70s, whereby fertility rates fell very rapidly, and that meant there were fewer and fewer children. Women were increasingly involved in the workforce. In countries like Italy and Spain, it meant that the fertility rate is now down to about 1.4. The median age of the population of Italy today is over 40. The median age of the people of Uganda is 14. And if you look at a figure like that, that tells you a great deal about religion. Let me explain why. I want you to imagine a society like contemporary Italy or Spain, societies that in the last 30 years have gone through a very rapid process of secularization, measured in terms of church attendance, of vocations. Think what happens to a society that has a great many children, where you take children out of the picture. You no longer have the same kind of attachment to the church or religious institutions through those institutes for community socialization, First Communion training, for example. It means that people become detached from their churches, their religious institutions. And it also means that as sex and reproduction become increasingly detached, people become more accepting of alternative attitudes to sexuality, of different ways of organizing families. Shrinking fertility rates tend to go along with what I regard as one of the great measures of secularization these days, the legalization of same-sex marriage. Societies with rapidly shrinking birth rates tend to be secular societies. Societies with very high birth rates, very high fertility rates, tend to be much more traditionally religious. What is the point of this? African fertility rates remain not just high, but far, far higher than even somebody like I thought they were going to be 5 years ago. And that means that societies like Uganda are doubling their population every 25 years or so. Summarize this quickly. In 1900, there were 2.5 Europeans for every African. By 2050, there'll be 2.5 Africans for every European. The world has turned upside down. It also means that societies like Nigeria, and Congo, and Ethiopia, and Uganda are going to have very large, young attending populations, and almost certainly very religious-oriented populations. I don't know if you saw the opinion surveys over the last couple of years on religious faith in Nigeria. 5 years ago, I believe, the opinion surveys were showing that 99% of people believed in God, but that turns out to be a statistical glitch, and the latest survey showed 100%. This is not statistically significant. I mentioned Uganda. It's not the most important country in Africa, but it's an interesting example. 1950, it had 5.5 million people. 75, it had 11 million people. 2000, it had 23 million people. And by many projections, by 2050, it could have 80 million people in a country the size of Oregon. However, those 80 million people will not be in Uganda, because countries like Italy and Germany and Spain need immigrants to do the jobs, to pay the taxes. And that is why you have seen so much migration from high fertility countries, more religious countries, into low fertility lands. And that, in a way, sets up a story that all churches have to deal with in a way, but the Catholic Church will be particularly affected by it because it is so strong and so numerous in these countries of migration. If I was projecting the world's largest Christian populations in 2050, the list would look like this. At the head would be the United States, followed in no particular order by Mexico, Brazil, Nigeria, the Congo, Ethiopia, Uganda, the Philippines, and China. What countries didn't I mention there? Britain, France, Italy, Spain. Germany may be making a final appearance on the list at that point, but there's some debate about that. But even when I mention those figures, at 2040 is probably the date at which there will be more Catholics in Africa than in Europe. Historically, that's quite interesting. My friend John Allen, who is such a wonderful commentator on the church worldwide, notes that during the 20th century, the Catholic population in Africa grew by a rate of 6,700%. I sometimes tell my students that anyone here who comes from a humanities or liberal arts background, that's more than double. And of course, it's not just Africa. Last year, a figure I'd like to quote in the Philippines had more Catholic baptisms than France, Spain, Italy, and Poland combined. But if you think about the countries I mentioned, you realize that actually that southern drift is even more than I suggested. Because I'm saying, well, over here you have Nigeria, and over here you have France. But don't forget, a lot of the Catholics in countries like France, even now, are from the Global South. I'll give you a figure. Back in the year 2000, the official figure was that about 65% of the world's Catholics lived in Africa, Asia, Latin America. Okay? By 2025, the official figure is that that number will be 75%. But that figure does not include people of global south origin living in the global north. It does not include Mexican Americans. It does not include Vietnamese people in France. It does not include Nigerians anywhere. And as you look across the board, you realize that already these diasporas have become so central to religion. In Great Britain, for example, if you look at the 4 largest mega churches in the country, and yes, Great Britain, that very, very secular country, has mega churches. The 4 largest are pastored by Africans. Nigerians especially are very hard to miss. Nigerians are very powerful on that. Some years ago, about 2 years ago, there was a very influential paper that appeared at an American learning conference. And what it tried to do was to predict the countries that by the year 2100, which is ambitious, would have no religion at all. And they had a list of 10. It was a very interesting list. I can't remember the 10, but approximately it was Britain, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Ireland, I'll say that again, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Czech Republic, Estonia. Mainly European, but you notice one thing there. 2 have been ruled by Great Britain at some point in your history. Seems to be a pretty good way of moving to future secularism. I've no idea what that aspect of the British disease is. But I come back to this idea of Ireland being a country without religion. And where you see it is you can measure it. You can measure it in the fertility rate. I'm going to say something that's going to sound very rash, but I'm prepared to defend it. If you take the country and show me its fertility rate, I will show you what its trends to secularization are. If it is 1.5, 1.6, I will tell you that if not now, then in a decade, that is going to be as secular as Britain or the Netherlands is right now. Oh, and just a digression that is not exactly a digression. It doesn't exactly fit in with the theme of today, but I just mentioned this. Do you know what countries have had the steepest falls in fertility in modern times, in the last 20 or 30 years? The countries that have gone from third world profiles of 6 children per woman down to 1.6. I'll give you a list of them. Iran, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia. There's a famous saying among demographers in Europe that the closer a woman lives to Rome, the fewer children she has. That's guaranteed to offend almost anyone. But it's also true on both sides of the Mediterranean. If you want to see a country that, by these figures, is going to be one of the most secular in the world in about a decade, it's Iran. I've already booked my place for the dinner following the first same-sex marriage in Tehran. Let's pull this together in terms of what this says for the Catholic Church. I've suggested that there are a couple of different realities, different situations that are so different in their way, but because of the movement of people and ideas will overlap. If I'm projecting, then I would say that in 2050, Africa increasingly is going to be the heart of the Catholic world, certainly numerically, because those numbers are rising fast. Many people thought the numbers were going to level off in mid-century. All the projections now are that they're not the fertility rates in black Africa between basically the Sahara and the Limpopo are continuing to be phenomenally high. And that is going to echo through and suggesting that a continuing degree of interest in religion, enthusiasm for religion, a rising tide lifts all boats. Catholic Church is exceedingly well situated to take advantage of that. So are all other churches. In fact, you have to work very hard if you have a church in Africa not to have it grow. I have a couple of examples of people who've handled it so badly that they are succeeding, but we will get to those. Catholic Church is doing very well indeed. The greatest problem facing the Vatican is, of course, that it is 2,000 miles too far north. And you have Europe. And it's possible to produce really, apocalyptic views of the church and the churches in Europe by any reasonable standard. Secularization is moving very rapidly, and you can look at that in terms of church attendance, of vocations. As I look, for instance, at vocations and the membership in seminaries, I usually apply the rule of 10. If you tell me what the figure was in 1965, divide it by 10, and that's what it is now. We think of France as a Catholic country, the eldest daughter of the church. Presently, well under 50% of French people declare themselves Catholic, even notionally, and that's quite dramatic. However, I still think there are forms of the church, ways of doing church, which will flourish even in what appears to be this miasmal swamp of secular Europe. One is diaspora communities. Wherever you go in Europe, if you want to see a lively, thriving Catholic church, look at the ones that appeal to immigrants. A couple of years ago, I went to a small city in Denmark called Aarhus. And if you know anything about Denmark, Catholics have never been a presence in Denmark, since the Reformation. And as we're driving around the city, you come to areas where the streets are blocked because of the throngs of hundreds of people in the middle of the street. And they're outside the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church does its services every Sunday in 5 languages. And we could actually play a game as to what these are. But they are, let me get this right, English, Polish, Vietnamese, Tagalog, and Chaldean. And any one of those will fill the streets. Danish is not one of the options. And that's not at all unusual. So you have these immigrant churches who are basically represent so large a part of the seminaries. Also true now in the western parts of the United States, especially if you go to a Californian seminary, you will see so many people who are, Vietnamese or Nigerian. I take the diocesan newsletter of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, and whenever they show the photos of new priests, they're Vietnamese, they're Korean, they're Nigerian, and a couple of white guys, all stock white guys. That cannot fail to have its effects on the definitions of the priesthood. There are European countries especially who in future years are going to have an increasingly foreign priesthood. And we're only beginning to think of some of the consequences of that. Back in the 1930s, Evelyn Waugh, who we don't normally think of as if you like, a radical critic of the church, imagined a far future world in his story Out of Depth. And it was a story where African clergy were reconverting a barbarous England. And you look at stories like that at the moment, and they don't seem too far-fetched. There are also different ways of doing church. How do you carry out mission? How do you live the church if you can no longer assume so many of the institutions on which you have lived for many hundreds of years? Assuming an alliance with the state? No. Assuming solidarity of families in schools? Assuming that people go to one workplace decade after decade and know each other in those sort of communities? No. What do you do? Well, that was one of the great contributions of particularly Pope Benedict, his emphasis on new ecclesial communities. The new ecclesial movements, the kind of movements like the Focolare and so on, which operate on a network basis, which move outside traditional parishes and structures. And here again I draw the obvious parallel between what's happening with some of the diasporic movements, which are often united by these alternative communities and networks. The ones I particularly looked at, of course, are some of the Filipino movements, groups like El Shaddai, Bukas Nupse Dios, which operate in literally dozens of countries among migrant workers, which coexist with parishes, but which provide alternate structures for an alternate world. In other words, without any great direction from edicts from on high, churches are restructuring to accommodate a new, very different world formed by new structures of economy and demography. So I mentioned a little bit about Africa. The other thing, by the way, if you look at Europe, it's fascinating. I talked about all this evidence of secularism. There's one oddity I would draw your attention to. Vocations in free fall. Church attendance in free fall. You know the one measure, the one index, which is not in free fall and which is thriving? We today live in the golden age of European pilgrimage. There are more pilgrims attending shrines and pilgrimage places than ever before in the continent's history. And I don't just mean because it has a larger population or because people can drive more easily. Places that in the 1950s might have 50 or 60,000 pilgrims in a year are attracting 4 and 5 million. Santiago de Compostela, which was a very small activity in the 50s, has become a multi-million attraction. We're seeing whole new shrines in recent years. Medjugorje is an obvious example. And you try and reconcile that with the other pictures, and what I would suggest very tentatively is that there is this vast hunger out there for something. And I think you see it a little bit in the response to things like, Dan Brown and the Da Vinci Code and the whole world of alternate pilgrimage to some of the places described in those books. It's there, it's just not being channeled into the organized church. And any movement which can build on that kind of interest, that kind of appeal, stands to play a very important role in reconstructing that European Catholicism. Possibly you think I'm being unfair when I talk about reconstructing. You may think it's not as bad as that yet, but all the auguries right now are working that way. And I would also add one other thing. If you look at the European Union, there are very bad signs of major clashes imminent between church and states and European Union over religious liberty issues, particularly over issues of gender, sexuality. In some ways it looks like being a very tough period for the Catholic Church as traditionally organized before it can get itself free from its traditional sense of alliance with states. Well, I talked about Europe as one extreme. I talked about Africa as the other extreme. But let me suggest one thing which perhaps has not been given enough emphasis. There are other large parts of the Catholic world which potentially are looking much more like Europe than Africa. And I particularly look at Latin America, which notionally is the largest Catholic continent, which by 2025 should have something like 40% of the world's Catholics. But where the demographics have developed a very European character, where women are not having children, where women are going out to work, and where the traditional churches, which above all means the Catholic Church, are having a very tough time holding on to their members. It's interesting that the country that has the most extreme demographics in that way would be Uruguay, followed by Argentina, something that the present Pope knows very well indeed, which I think goes a long way to explaining why he is so conscious of the need to pay attention to so many issues, of so many grievances over gender and politics and so on. But if I am right with the kind of projection I'm talking about, Latin America is going to look very European and very secular, and that's going to have a lot of impact on the kind of diaspora communities that we see. I think if you look at Europe, there is a lot of hope that European Christianity stands to benefit enormously from these diasporas. You notice I talked about the Islamic countries that are now failing to produce children in anything like large numbers. Well, suppose you're in France, or Germany, or Italy, and you need immigrants. You have to have immigrants to do the jobs and pay the taxes. Where do you get them? Well, Algeria can't export anymore. They don't have the people to run their own country. So you dip deeper and deeper into Africa, and deeper into Christian Africa. One of the great misunderstandings I think we have when we look at European migrants and migration is we see those migrants in terms of being Muslims. A lot of them are, a lot of them aren't, a lot of them are Christian. If you look at the communities which rioted in France in 2005, if you look at those communities, a lot of them are characterized by mosques and by African churches, and by churches from around the world. See it as more in terms of class and race than religion. I think Europe's immigrant communities are going to become more Christian in years to come. That's certainly the case in a country like England already, or the Netherlands. I can take you to areas in Amsterdam, which I love dearly because they are the revenge against the 20th century. In Amsterdam in the late 20th century, they tried to build an area in the southwest, which is going to be this planner's dream of all these beautifully modern apartments, and the one thing they wouldn't have there is churches, because no modern people needed churches anymore. And if you go there on a Sunday, every garage and every shed has got its own church, because these are now African diaspora communities. If you go to the Dutch churches in the city of Amsterdam, good luck finding them anything other than museums. So I'm, in that way, a very optimistic person. Let us assume, for the sake of argument, that those diaspora communities are so important. What does that mean in terms of the kind of Christianity we're talking about? And one thing I've said is that it would be a different kind of structures, more emphasis on networks, transnational networks, possibly not so closely attached to traditional parish and diocesan structures. But it would also mean a different kind of appeal. If you are trying to hold on to communities that are detaching from the church for a variety of reasons, how do you repackage represent the message, to hold on to them. And there are several things. The one word I emphasize above all is healing. As I look at the kinds of Christianity which flourish around the world, and yes, in the Catholic Church as much as in any other, they're characterized by, above all, by a very powerful emphasis on healing of body and mind and spirit and soul and society, all as a comprehensive package. The Catholic movements that have been most successful in resisting Pentecostal and secular challenges in Latin America have been the ones that have adopted very Pentecostal styles of worship, with an emphasis also on healing. I remember one story that I think I featured in Next Christendom. I want you to imagine a church in Central Africa where there's been a special service, and in best Pentecostal style, a woman wants to give testimony of how she's been healed from a spinal complaint that's troubled her for many years, so she gives testimony. And someone else says, I want to give testimony too, I have been healed. So this goes on, and on, and on. And eventually the deacon starts kind of looking at his watch and saying, well, if we want to get out of here by next Sunday, we have to do something different. All right. Any of you who want to report being healed of this kind of disease, put your hands up now. Good, 24, right. You, this kind of disease. What kind of church was it? Well, obviously, it's a Roman Catholic Church. And the special service was the exposition of the Blessed Sacrament. Denominations, they don't mean nothing, but they have a very different quality to them. And don't forget, these are societies that are the ultimate buyer's market for religion. People are not required or expected to be members of any church by right or assumption. They can go anywhere. They can divide their custom among multiple churches. They can go to this church here for this. They can go to this church for healing. They can go to this miracle crusade here. And what does the church do about that? One solution is just to accept that there's going to be that sort of shopping, and try and present the best message that is possible within the particular community. Another area in which the Catholic Church in 2050 is going to be a very different bunch is that it is going to be obviously dealing with other religions in a much more intimate and intense way than European churches have known for these many centuries. Think about it, for the last 1,000 years, for most Catholics at least, the religious other was Jews. The Orthodox, of course, had their interactions with Muslims. If you want to think of the world's largest Catholic countries in the near future, think of countries where Catholics exist alongside other religious communities, possibly as minorities, possibly as 50-50 communities. Think that through. What does that mean? What does that mean about evangelism? In a society that lives perfectly happily, provided that nobody does anything provocative. Does that mean that the call to go and take the gospel to all nations is suspended? Does it mean that mission has to continue, but by means of living exemplary lives? A famous phrase, attributed probably wrongly to St. Francis about, preach by all means, if necessary, use words. What are those relationships with other religious communities? Most European Catholics, most American Catholics have not had to deal with those issues for a great many years. Those are going to be absolutely central to the Catholic Church in 2050. Think of a church which is, above all, a church of the poor, Again, something that at least most European Catholics sort of got out of the habit of thinking in modern times. But think of what that means for understanding the Bible, what it means for understanding the commands of the Church. Imagine preaching Gospels and preaching parables to a society where parables make sense that they haven't done in the rich world for a very long time. People who actually know that if they lose a coin, they are going to have to sweep out the whole house to find it, or the kids don't eat that night. People who can identify very readily with the sense of going down to this village and being attacked and left to die, and as a good person comes along to meet them, where you go along to a market and you are going to meet women possessed by familiar spirits, where the occult and demonic are very familiar forces. You know, I sometimes ask people if you had to take a verse of the Bible or a passage from the Bible to present its message to people who knew nothing of it at all, what would that verse be? What would you take? Might you take something from the Sermon on the Mount? Well, my own answer would be one which is a little bit unusual, which is, I take a verse from the Gospel of James, Epistle to James, which is, sorry, I've been working on alternate Gospels recently, bear with me, the Epistle to James, where James says, you say that tomorrow you will do this business, you'll go to this city, you'll organize this conference. You fool, you can't say that. Your life is a vapor, your life is a mist which rises and fades away. What you should say is, if it is God's will, I will do this. Why is that so powerful? Imagine a society where people do have very short lifespans. You know, I teach university students, they are all immortal. They all know that they're going to be partying like it's 2099. Imagine a world where people do die regularly in their mid or late 30s, and you feel that your life is a vapor, a mist that rises and fades away. Christians use that verse to convert Muslims around the world. Muslims use it to convert Christians. Christians use it to convert Buddhists. A few years ago, a British publisher presented a series called Revelations, which took books of the Bible in the King James Version, so they wouldn't have to pay royalties, and they got them introduced by famous spiritual leaders like Bono. And who do you think introduced the Epistle of James? The Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama said, well, I don't know much about Christianity. I do know a lot about Buddhism. This is a classic definition of Buddhist teaching. If you live in a world where life is very short and hazardous, that is the basis of all pastoral approach. The point I'm making is that Catholicism is changing very rapidly, that by 2050 it will be very different, and if you want to understand how, please learn to pay attention to demographics. If you look at a country and its fertility rate, you'll learn a lot about its religion, and that may sound strange, but honestly, it really is. And in case any of you think I'm being, I don't know, pessimistic or doom-laden here, I just want to read a passage to you that some of you may know. It's a passage that is much more known, better known in Great Britain than it is in the United States, but I still draw your attention to it. Back in 1840, the great English writer Lord Macaulay was asked to review the great history of the popes by the German historian von Ranke. And he wrote this, and I'll just read selections from it, but it's kind of interesting. This is 1840, and this is at a time when anti-Catholicism was so strong in England. There is not, and there never was on this earth, a work of human policy so well deserving of examination as the Roman Catholic Church. The history of that church joins together the two great ages of human civilization. Where are we? It flourished in the ancient world. The papacy remains not in decay, not a mere antique, but full of life and youthful vigour. The Catholic Church is still sending forth to the farthest ends of the world missionaries as zealous as those who landed in Kent with Augustine, still confronting hostile kings with the same spirit with which she confronted Attila. The number of her children is greater than in any former age. Her acquisitions in the New World have more than compensated for what she has lost in the Old, he said in 1840. Her spiritual ascendancy extends over the vast countries which lie between the plains of the Missouri and Cape Horn in Argentina, countries which a century hence may not improbably contain a population as large as that which now inhabits Europe. No, that couldn't happen. Nor do we see any sign which indicates that her term of her long dominion is approaching. She saw the commencement of all the governments and of all the ecclesiastical establishments that now exist in the world. And we feel no assurance that she is not destined to see the end of them all. She was great and respected before the Saxons set foot in Britain, before the Frank had passed the Rhine, when Grecian eloquence still flourished at Antioch, when idols were still worshipped in the temple of Mecca. And she may still exist in undiminished vigour when some traveller from New Zealand shall, in the midst of a vast solitude, take his stand on a broken arch of London Bridge to sketch the ruins of St. Paul's. Now that's a prophetic vision. All empires may fail, but the Catholic Church is going to continue and going to flourish. And if I was talking about the Catholic Church in 2050, I would say, get set for what numerically is going to be one of the greatest ages in Catholic history. So you see, I can end on an optimistic note. And with that, I will wind up. Thank you. Shall I come sit there? Oh, whatever. So,
Professor Jenkins will be happy to take questions. There's a microphone here. Perhaps I can take the opportunity to start us off. And I'm wondering how you see these demographic shifts coalescing with other fairly predictable demographic changes that are in the offing. Some predictions by 2050 that there will be 200 million climate refugees around the world. Young populations have traditionally bred high levels of unemployment, leading to civil unrest.
Mm-hmm.
There are at present and are likely to be more in the future resource wars in Africa over control of natural resources. And of course then we have in the Western Hemisphere, we have significant elements of xenophobia among some of the receiving countries for migrants. So what's the church in all these more difficult kinds of demographic shifts that are likely to happen?
Well, the climate refugees one is a huge unknown, and that depends on a couple of projections which you may or may not expect. I will give you a figure which does alarm me. I oversimplify, but your likelihood of being killed in a war in Africa in the last 30 years is directly proportional to the number of Christians in that country. The more Christian the country, the more likely it is to have been involved in a major war or civil war. Now that's an alarming figure. On the xenophobia one, the thing which really startles me in some ways is how little kind of active, organized resentment there has been. I mean, there might be resentment, but there has been nothing like what you might have expected in earlier years. We don't basically see, organized fascist groups or gangs in any numbers. Partly because you no longer have among the old stock white population in Europe that kind of bulge of teenagers and young adults. They're not there. You know, if you have people who are in their 40s and 50s, they may say uncharitable things, but they're not going out to throw bombs. So in some ways, I'm not so surprised about that. But the sheer volume of immigration in England, for instance, or European countries, really has been astonishing by the levels of those countries. By American standards, the thought of having such multicultural, multinational societies is not so startling. In Europe it is. It's new. And it's really been accomplished with remarkably little violence. Wasn't part of your question, but one thing I would add is the most interesting things for me is how far these migrant communities will take European standards and ideas back to their own countries. And that's one of the big reasons you're seeing the demographic shifts in North Africa. New ideas about gender, family, transforming in that way. Please. Keep your fingers filming away.
I wonder if you could say something about when you see the growth of these churches and the demographics. Part of the the other text is really what evangelization will look like, in 2050. And do you have any thoughts on really what's working and how some methods of evangelization will adapt to these changes?
I'm always anxious to define the word evangelization for this reason. When we look at religious shifts, we look at it in terms of mission and evangelization. Don't forget, much religious change, much religious movement, much of the spread of religions does not happen through conscious mission or evangelization. It happens because people move from country A to country B. They form religious communities which grow and which develop a sizable religious life. Those communities attract newcomers who find there a sense of community, they find support there in terms of welfare, health, education that they can't get from the secular society, and so those churches flourish. The fact that, to give an example, that 20th century America developed very substantial Italian Catholic communities was not because of a bunch of Italian Catholics who set off to convert large sections of America. Italians moved. They took their institutions with them. Those institutions became very strong, very powerful on American soil. And so there is mission, there is deliberate mission, there's accidental mission. And a lot of the movement that we see, a lot of the diaspora movement, has the effect of being, of spreading the faith, of evangelization, but it's not consciously trying to do that. I'll give you an example. Nigerians in Britain arrived. They tried to turn up to the local Anglican churches, where they found so many sort of racist looks and hostility, that they went off and formed their own churches. And those churches then became mission sending in their own right. So it wasn't originally like that. I would say that the most successful forms of evangelization are ones that take full account of new demographic realities and realities in family and the workplace. A great example I would give of that, in Great Britain, in Anglican churches, some Anglican parishes have effectively become charismatic megachurches in their own right. And they've done that partly under the influence of African and Latin American churches. The great example is Holy Trinity Brompton. And you may be familiar with a tactic that church has created, which is called the Alpha Course. How many people are familiar with the Alpha Course? Okay, majority, I think. But that is based on the idea that, here's the assumption: I am not going to be working with you for 2 years because we won't be in the same workplace. Your kids are not in school with mine because neither of us has kids. We are isolated, atomized individuals, and I want you to network, to join me, and we're going to get together with a bunch of people you don't know who will become friends, And we're going to explore the basic truths of Christianity, and we're going to work through a course that consists of pastor and videos, those two crucial elements, and ideally where we bring somebody towards a declaration of faith in Christ, in a particularly Pentecostal form, charismatic form. But that strikes me as brilliant in how it, whatever complaints you could make about it, in terms of how it adapts itself to the realities of a post-industrial society. One cardinal referred to the Alpha Course as the greatest gift of Protestantism to the Catholic Church in modern times, one of the two greatest gifts, and the other one was the Pentecostal movement, which is an interesting comparison. But I think any form of evangelization has to take that sort of network effect into account. The old assumptions about large parishes where people are not so heavily involved have to fade away and be replaced by these smaller, highly active, more committed societies like the new ecclesial movements that provide a degree of, if you like, family involvement that just is not possible in a decentralized post-industrial world. So those would be a couple of my answers. But I look at something like Alpha, and I'm very admiring of it. People say bad things about it, but they say it's very simplistic. Well, maybe it is, but it's getting people who know literally nothing about Christianity into these groups. Can I just ask you, by the way, to join me in an effort of imagination? I say things like, oh, they know nothing about Christianity. It's very hard to imagine that. You know, everyone in this room has a very strong sense of Christianity. There's a story I tell in one of my books where somebody's reporting being behind a group of school kids, of teenagers, in an art gallery in the Czech Republic. Historically, it's a great center of Christian culture. And they're looking at a picture of the crucifixion. And one person is saying, oh, that's terrible. Who did that to him? And another girl is saying, oh, the communists. I have had the experience of standing behind parties of school kids in English cathedrals, where the teacher is trying to explain concepts about places, and where you have to start is incredible. Now, this is the Eucharist. Does anyone know what the Eucharist is? Okay. Well, you have the Last Supper. Nobody knows what the Last Supper is. Well, you have Jesus. Somebody's heard of Jesus. Can you imagine taking people from that through the Christian message? And it's extremely difficult. And the Alpha Course is trying to rectify that. Maybe I'd do it differently, but anyone else? Please.
Hi there. I have two somewhat unrelated questions. First one is, are there any Christian churches that are showing growth in low birth rate countries? And second, is media becoming or decreasing being a factor in countries perhaps that where media was not a factor anymore? Is that kind of a dead trend? I mean, the internet will always be, but.
Yeah. Well, the short answer to the first one is if you take low birth countries and you look among sort of old stock people in Britain, for example, or the Netherlands, we have some churches growing magnificently, and they're immigrant churches. The only ones which are really catching up among old stock populations would be some of these charismatic churches, like these parishes, the Church of England, that have basically gone charismatic, but they are growing from a very small base. Okay. I don't know how many are familiar with one of the most kind of remarkable church experiences in that way. The Sunday Adelaide, familiar with that story? Here's the story. Back in the late 80s, the Soviet Union was in the business of taking bright students from Africa and Asia and Latin America, training them in the Soviet Union so they could be sent home as practicing Marxist-Leninists. Okay? They brought a Nigerian guy called Sunday Adelaide over to Russia, over to the Ukraine actually, and a few years afterwards the Soviet Union collapsed, and so he was there and didn't know what to do, and he formed a church which has become the largest single Christian congregation in Europe. It's called the Embassy of the Blessed Kingdom of God. It is run by Nigerians, but its membership is pretty much entirely white. It is Belarusian, or it is Ukrainian. It is actually quite a significant power in the contemporary Ukraine. It's sort of its mothership claims 50,000 members. If you go online, look at their website, then you can see lots of testimonies of healing from cancer and AIDS and raising from the dead. But what will strike you is all the people reporting this are white people with names like Boris and Natasha. And it is a very remarkable thing. So that is an example of a growth in one of the lowest fertility countries in the world, the Ukraine. Russia is a close second. So it's detonated by Global South people, but it develops legs in the Global North. And then you have other examples like in London, for instance, you have this great church of Matthew Ashimolowo, again, Nigerian, but overwhelmingly that appeals to black people, African and Afro-Caribbean. But what's different about Sunday Adelaide's group is that it draws in a wide audience. Okay. Oh, and Sunday Adelaide has had a ton of legal problems in recent years and financial problems, and the jury is very much out as to whether he has been a corrupt pastor or whether this is what happens to people who annoy governments in the Ukraine. We can toss a coin on that. Where there actually is a close correlation between media and a major impact on religious behavior, you see it in North Africa, and you see it with a shift in Islamic countries, Islamic societies that I talked about. If you go anywhere in North Africa or the Middle East, you can see, you can look at an area and you can tell its politics and its social outlook by which way its satellite dishes face. Because if they face to Europe, you tap on the door, what does that face to Europe? Oh, we watch the football. And yeah, they do. But they also get a lot of other stuff, sending these messages about proper role of family, role of women, they get religious broadcasting. And in North Africa, the name for a satellite dish is a parabolique. And the Muslim clergy call them paradiabolique, because they spread the word of the devil. And it's the societies with the biggest exposure to satellite dishes that have the sharpest fall in fertility. And if you say, that sounds mechanistic, I say, yep. But it just happens to be right. But if you go to Jordan, for example, you have towns, and some of them are pointed to the big Saudi-based channels, and they're very, very pious. But the others are getting the football from Europe. You get a lot of other stuff too. That's the clearest example of a direct media effect. Please. Oh, by the way, and just one real quick follow-up on that. Please note that the change is not, sending hypnotic messages saying, you will abandon your religious traditional ways. It's that it's kind of implicit. This is what, normal society looks like these days. Oh, you're not living like that. I'm sorry, please.
Well, thank you very much. I happen to be a sociologist, and I've also worked quite a lot in population studies and demography. So I appreciate the attention to the demographic context. fertility to something like economic growth, political stability, in this case religion. But I didn't hear enough of the causal explanation of why you think that might be. One might simply say, poor people have more children and they're also more religious. I don't think that's what you're saying, but I think we need to draw that out a little bit more. And I also wonder to what extent these broad generalizations don't have extremely important exceptions that we also need to theorize. And I think of China, maybe Korea, places that have very low fertility, but also seem to me to have a rise in Christianity. I could be wrong about that. But so then just what is the usefulness of these extremely broad generalizations?
Sure. There's certainly extremely broad generalizations. If you go to Korea and you talk to anyone in these flourishing churches, the one thing that they will tell you absolutely is that they don't have the younger generation anymore, and they don't have a youth element in the churches. The Koreans are absolutely convinced that not so much that they've lost a generation, but there isn't a generation to lose. The Koreans are extremely dark to the point of view of apocalyptic, of projecting the future of their churches, and they will very explicitly talk about those demographic changes. Okay? China's an interesting one. The actual numbers in China are interesting. The growth is certainly over the last 25 years. You are certainly dealing with low population growth. I think it's more than compensated for by the massive uprooting of people from the countryside into the cities, where in the cities they need these kind of institutions to ensure their survival. The big European exception to what I'm suggesting would be a country like Poland, where Poland has very typical European demographics, very low fertility, but still appears to have very high religiosity. I mean, they're still producing vocations at extremely high level. And, there are a couple of approaches there. One is that, okay, there is something wrong with the theory. The other one is that due to Poland's particular history, religion has become so completely tied up in national identity, national survival, and independence, that at least for a generation, the old ways are going to continue. I don't know, but that would be a great example. As to the causation and correlation one, I think in the European experience, I think it's a little bit of the one feeds into the other. I sometimes say, which comes first, the chicken or the lack of eggs? And it goes something like this. Women have fewer children. They go out into the workplace. They are more likely then to have fewer children. Increasingly they become detached from the institutions which were pushing traditional views of family and reproduction. And so the detachment is a gradual process over a couple of generations. That's what I'm seeing in Italy and Spain, which are the classic examples. We're now seeing that in Ireland. I would also say something at the risk of certain controversy. I think if you look at a country like Ireland, the rapid drift away from the church in terms of loyalties and numbers is not driven by recent child abuse issues. It's that those child abuse issues were themselves a byproduct of an already existing secularization. Those could not have been reported, the scandals could not have been broken if the church's hold in society had not already been massively cracked beforehand. But once they get going, they provide a justification. I'm very conscious of the idea that there is no such thing as a simple causation, but I think the one feeds into the other, and the two then work together. But as I said, countries like Italy and Spain, I urge you to look at those. Over time, those numbers then creep up overall when you factor in new immigrant families, because they raise the average significantly. But it's an interesting question. It's only when you see the importance of children for organized religion, you only see it when you take children out of the picture. Here's an interesting thought. You want to talk about what the churches should be doing in 2050. How about catering? How about focusing on the needs of very, very old people? Focusing on the needs of people of 70s, 80s, 90s, 100s. You know, the church I attend in Texas, if you go into the pews, they have a card where they want new members, and they say, put your name and address here, which describes your age category. And then they, you know, what is it, 20 to 30. And the last one is 60 and up. You know, 60-death. Which I find a little insensitive, okay? But it seems to me that as churches think hard about their missions and what they do for this world, they're going to have to take account of those demographics. You know, if you turn up at a church and the only activities they have consist of things relating to the school and children, and you have so many people who aren't going to have children at school, but they are concerned with providing companionship and support for the old and the very old. Well, how's that for a reconceptualization of what churches are and should be doing? By 2050, these will be very old societies. And the countries that are really going to be in deep trouble are countries like Iran and Middle Eastern countries, where the economies probably will not have caught up with the extent that they need to support these very old populations. Whole new fields of mission, but I just wanted to get that off my chest about the 60 and up. I thought that was cruel. Not that it applies to me. I was born in 1952 and I'm 39. Please.
Dr. Jenkins, I'd like some observations on your part about the Christianity in the United States in the years ahead in terms of regionalization of the way Christianity works in some parts of the country as opposed to others. Or if you think that's ever going to even still be an issue at all in the future, what are some of your thoughts about Christianity in the United States?
Sure. Well, I draw a very sharp distinction between Christianity in the United States and in Europe. And where you look at diasporas, migration communities, in Europe I can actually see them building whole new structures of Christianity. In the United States I think they will provide extra layers. They will add new strata to what is already there. Be very cautious reading recent surveys about nuns and people of no affiliation and so on. Some of those figures are deeply troubled. The United States is still a vastly more religious society than Europe, and is likely to remain so for the foreseeable future. Regionalization, America has always been an extremely diverse society religiously. The more you look back historically, the more surprising things you find. For example, far more Americans are members of churches today than they were on the eve of the Civil War, for example. That doesn't mean that people are more religious today, but they're more likely to join and belong to institutions. Okay? I can see more homogenization. It's a well-known trend in the sociological literature that some of those regional peculiarities, some of the southernness are in retreat. And there are these various measures. You can see maps where certain kinds of southern speech are retreating steadily through Virginia and North Carolina. The South is withdrawing in that way. But that's partly because religious habits which were once southern have become nationalized, particularly through megachurches. So The other big difference, I suppose, you're going to see in the US, when people write the history of Christianity in the US, and above all when they write the history of Catholicism, I think there's one date that they need to pay attention to absolutely centrally. What is it? 1776? No, 1965. The Immigration Act, which in the words of Senator Ted Kennedy, this act does not mean that the United States will have a great influx of people from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. On that, as on many things, he was dead wrong. But it also meant that a huge number of those people were Christian. They were Korean Christians. 75% of Arabs in the United States are Christian. Whenever I'm arguing with somebody like Professor Diana Eck, who's a wonderful scholar, my point is always that America is one of the world's least religiously diverse countries. It's overwhelmingly a Christian society. So, but if I was predicting the future in the United States, clearly a much more kind of ethnically diverse society. Before 2050, probably the United States will be a majority-minority country. There are, as you very well know, Texas is already a majority-minority state, so is California, so is Hawaii, New Mexico. That will spread throughout the whole country. Radical kind of change, and it raises the question, not so much for the Catholic Church, because I think they're familiar with it, but for other churches. What are you going to do with this? Are you going to carry on with an all-white church or an all-black church as you've done for generations? Are you going to ignore the society that's out there and that young people especially are going to regard as absolutely the normal way of existing? They live in a multicultural, multi-ethnic society. So do you adopt the strategy of, I don't see it, I don't see it? Or if not, what? Now, as I say, the Catholic Church, I think, is way ahead of the process on this. They've known about this for a very long time. I always say that globalization, by the way, here's another great date. I always say that globalization began in the year 1578. Why is that? Because that's the year that you had the creation of the first global empire, and it was a Catholic empire, and that's the year that the Diocese of Manila in the Philippines was founded as a suffragan of the Archdiocese of Mexico City. And I always say that's the first global institution in the world. Before that, you just had these piddling little Roman empires and Mongol empires, but that was the global one. But same factors, age shifts, ethnic shifts, but I see it overwhelmingly within a Christian context.
Oh, thank you for the predictions. I have just one question. I want to ask you to step back a little bit in terms of the prediction you give us perhaps the future. If you could step back, perhaps any year which you like, perhaps 1950s, and see if your argument still holds water. If you step back in terms of the fertility argument that you have made,
Right.
and you said perhaps in 1950 or 1970, and identify the countries that are perhaps which you can give us to make your argument.
So, in other words, if I was writing in, say, the 1950s, would I have predicted these kind of changes? Yeah. In the 1950s, they really had not started yet, the ones I'm talking about. European fertility was still was still very high. We're still in the post-war baby boom years at that point. The real crash doesn't come after that, to which you might draw a very reasonable response, that is that things can change in a decade or two, and they absolutely can. To which my point would be, yeah, but we now appear to have been in these patterns for a good 30 years, and they seem set. Things could change. African fertility could collapse. European fertility could rebound. But all I can say is they show no signs of doing it. And particularly in the European case, I don't see any signs of the social changes that would be necessary to cause that. So, you know, it's very hard to go back in the past like that. But, you know, wasn't it the great sociologist, Yogi Berra, who said, you know, making predictions is hard, especially about the future. But it's doubly hard if you're doing it from the past and imagining a future in that way. So that is a little tough. That's not a coward's answer, honestly. It's just, I don't think that I can do that.
Thank you very much, Professor Jenkins. We're very